Hi, welcome to the Reintegrate podcast. I'm David Lotney.
And I'm Bob Robinson.
Anybody who is a regular listener to this podcast will have heard the name Steven Garber mentioned a lot. Not only was Steve Garber Bob's doctoral mentor, but he has also influenced and gained friends with many of our previous guests.
Yes, I am honored to count him as a friend. His wisdom has seeped into my bones, and it tends to do that for anyone who is blessed to have time with him.
Yes, he led the doctoral cohort you were in that was
Yep,
about how faith informs vocation to make
uh,
a difference in culture.
that's right. That's right. Faith, vocation, culture. He was the principal, the founding principal of the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture. And so that was basically the title of the doctorate, Faith, Vocation, and Culture. We went around the country and talked with business leaders and pastors, people who were committed to seeing Christians' vocations making a difference for God's mission. So we also went to Washington, D.C., where Steve was anchored, and he talked to people there that he's been talking to who are trying to work for Jesus in various capacities in government and in NGOs, doing good work in systems, a system that is pretty broken, but has real opportunities for to make impact, but are broken. We heard their stories. We watched what they experienced. We listened to what God is calling these men and women to do.
And as I think of those people in Washington, I wonder how do they hold on to hope when they can never bring God's perfect flourishing here?
You know,
All of us want to make sense of life. All of us want to make sense of our work, our relationships, and our place in the world. Who are we? Why are we here? What should we do with our lives? And is there a hope I can cling to as I struggle to make a slight difference in the world?
our guest is Steven Garber. He has spent his life as a teacher of many people in many places, including his work as senior fellow for vocation and the common good for the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust and the Economics of Mutuality Alliance. He was the founding principal for the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture, and Steve continues his work as senior fellow for the Institute for Marketplace Transformation. Steve is the author of some fantastic books, the latest one being Hints of Hope, Essays on Making Peace with the Proximate. Hi, Steve.
Well, there's the almost Colorado boy in my life.
Oh,
Oh
the
yeah.
almost Colorado boy looking at
Uh,
the fully Colorado man.
when you move there, you have to realize, yes, I don't really deserve the native license plate that Steve Garber does, but I've I'm a semi-hopeful native or something. I got here as quick as I could. Maybe that'll be your license plate. Uh, any further plans?
We're having crazy time of packing up this house. Uh,
Well,
it's like, boy, is that fun? Not fun.
not that I remember doing that a year ago now. So,
Yeah, you did it. Where did you move?
from Washington, D.C. to Charlottesville, Virginia. So,
Oh,
yeah.
so you were in Virginia before. You just moved
Yeah,
to a different part of
for
Virginia,
two hours south. Yeah,
2 hours south.
yeah.
Yeah. 30 years in this house is like a lot of fun to try to figure out how to pack that up. And you had
I
what, probably 40 years in your house, right?
we had 35. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're very similar. Yeah. I told Meg, I know blindfolded I could make every turn in this house and know just how many steps to go left and how many steps to go right, and I'd be blindfolded or on the dark, and this was my house. I knew this house. Uh,
Sure.
yeah.
I wish I'd have known that. I could have snuck into your house and like moved a
Uh,
bookshelf and made you
yeah,
run
yeah.
into it.
Something like that you could have had. But I would say, Bob, it's been a surprising providence a year later that we would like living where we are. So it's been a good move. So I didn't know that it would be a year ago. I was pretty up and down as the days went by, but then I finally decided we're going to do it. So I didn't look back after that moment. So Yeah.
Well, it's always a great pleasure of mine to introduce friends of mine. So, David, this is my friend Steve. Steve, this is my friend David.
David, good to meet you here. Yeah.
Yeah, really nice to meet you.
Hmm.
I know last time I think it was Brendan that was on the podcast with you
Uh-huh.
guys.
Yeah.
So Brendan's a good
Mhm.
friend of mine, as I was also a student leader working with Bob at the
Okay.
campus. So
Very great. Very good.
yeah,
He finds good
Good.
guys, good helpers, good companions. Yeah.
I've known you, Steve, for about 20 years, but
I know.
you've been doing good work, helping to reintegrate faith and vocation and all of life for a very long time. You've been doing it professionally for some 40 plus years, I would guess, right? Is
That's
that
a good
right?
no that's a good number, 40 plus years. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But you started asking these deep questions of life at a very young age, from your time in Monte Vista, Colorado, to when you
That's
dropped out of college and traveled around the world to learn from people all over the world. Can you tell us a bit of that story?
so the Monte Vista, one is a good one to begin with, Bob, because I was born there, of course, under the wonders and glories of the Sangre de Cristos. So when you move to Colorado, you'll have to go down and ponder these majestic mountains called the Sangre de Cristos, which the Spanish explorers one night seeing the sunset over the mountains, these 14,000-foot peaks, about 100 miles of them, said, look, in Spanish, Sangre de Cristo. Uh, they call these the blood of Christ mountains, which they seem to be tinged with the blood of Christ at sunset. But I was born there in a beautifully, I argued with a big smile on my face, it's the most beautifully named town in all of America, Monte Vista, Colorado. So, and
Mm.
I've always been glad to have been born there instead of some other place. But I would say the most pondering I was doing, even in those earliest days, was probably my eyes beginning to get used to the world around me and knowing that 20 miles away were these glorious mountains. So I have some sense of cosmic ontological home actually in that place because I know that in some ways I began to see the world, which is what we and I are talking about tonight, to see the world, but to see the world, through the eyes I had as a little boy, a little baby boy, looking up at these mountains and the vastness and the grandeur of the Rocky Mountains. And, but I didn't stay there forever, and I moved to California and really grew up in California. Um, and and eventually, 20 years later, I dropped out of college. Not because I was failing, not so much that. I don't think it was more I wanted a better reason to be a student that I had, which at that point was simply to pass the next test. I to do the reading required and to pass the next test and go on the next test and the next test and then finally a last test, then you're done with the semester. And that just seemed to me in my 20-year-old self not a very compelling reason to be a college student. And I decided to drop out. Uh, Now, in some ways, dropping out maybe was more understandable in that period of time. It was the counterculture, the late counterculture in American society and history. And but I was really the only friend I had who dropped out. I don't think anybody that I really knew very well was thinking about doing that. I decided to do that and um, lived for a couple of years in what we called then communes, which was a sort of a sociological experiment in the countercultural days, where people who were married and unmarried living in the same dwelling, working on some common life together. I happened to be in one that was produced a couple of magazines, and because I had some journalistic experience, I was, as a 20-year-old, appointed to be the managing editor of these magazines. And one was called Renaissance, a radically Christian critique of culture, was this tagline for it. And in some ways, that really appealed to me because, revolutionary at heart in some ways. I hitchhiked across America the next summer and made my way to Europe the next year to live in another commune. This one was a maybe a better known one. It was called L'Abri, and
Mm.
people from all over the world hitchhiked their way into the community of L'Abri, and there were no internets at the time and no brochures. It's simply the word on the street was if you had an honest question, you could give an honest answer at L'Abri. And that was very intriguing to me, very important to me at the time. I had a question that was burning in my heart, and I took that question there and I began to ask it and think about it and ask it and think about it and ask and think about it some more. And And I would say, honestly speaking, that that question has still threaded its way through the rest of my life. I've never left that question behind. I've, in the best language of Aslan to the children of Narnia, I've gone further up and further in to that question in all the years since then. But I would say that question is still the driving question of my life. So that's a little bit of that background.
All right, we're on pins and needles.
Oh my, okay.
What's the
Uh-huh.
question? What's
Uh-huh.
the question?
Well, I was living in the Bay Area, so I was hitchhiking every week between Palo Alto and Berkeley, homes of Stanford University and the University of California at Berkeley, and they were both sort of centers of intellectual robustness, and a lot of debate, a lot of everything going on in those years, and all the lectures and speakers that were coming to speak about the way the world ought to be or how the way the world shouldn't be were coming to those places, and I tried hard to listen in on to many of them, and I began to realize that year living in that first commune that every debate I listened to, every idea I heard, argued for, at its heart was always one more window into what we believe to be true about human beings. Or to put it in sort of philosophical, theological language, what is the nature of man? Um, and I realized that every political argument, every economic analysis, every artistic hope, every sexual, push and shove was always one more window into what somebody believed to be true about what it means to be human. And uh, and I knew enough Christian theology at that point in my life because I'd been raised to think in those terms, but I was wrestling with all that at the time too. That Christians taught that we're made in the image of God. That it seemed a very short sentence to me as a 20-year-old. And I remember thinking, I need to understand what that means. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And that question took me to L'Abri, which I spent time thinking through there. And I would say, honestly, that that's really been the driving question of my life. Even, my undergraduate studies eventually, my master's thesis, and my PhD work were all is one more window into, and we're working away at that question of who are we as human beings. Even now, when I talk about this question of vocation all over the world, I would always say, well, in my mind, it's really three questions that have to be looked at together. The first is, who are we? The second is, why are we? And the third is, then what will we do with our lives? So in some ways, I've never really left that question. I've just gone deeper into it over the years of my life. And you realize that when you take those questions seriously, that on one level, every human being takes them seriously in one way or another, whether they think they are being serious or not. Every one of us, every son of Adam, every daughter of Eve, whatever we believe to be true about the universe, uh, operates out of a sense of, I think this is who I am. I think this is why I am. It could be as starkly, soberly, terrible as we eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's all that this is. You know, and it could be every variety of sophisticated, more thoughtful response to that question. But I would say all of us begin there. And so in my mind, there's never ever a boring person out there. It's maybe simply we haven't learned to ask the right questions of other people. Because if we were able to ask more creative, more innovative, more persistent, more honest, more eager questions, we would find that all of us, every one of us, lives out of a certain set of assumptions about who we are as human beings and why we are as human beings. Um, so that's been very important to me. Looking at who you are, Bob, and our long friendship together, I think about, you know, um, some years ago, I was invited to speak at the Beijing Film Academy in China, which is the major film school for all of Asia. And even though the topic was good stories and good societies, I really fixed myself on that question, um, quoting the American novelist and essayist Walker Percy, that bad books lie. They lie most of all about the human condition. I took that thesis of Percy's and said, well, it's also true, of course, that bad films lie. They lie most of all about the human condition. So took up several of their most prominent Chinese films at that moment in time and their best director in China, uh, and looking at, so what did he argue in terms of what it means to be a human being? And that was the substance of the day together we had there. So that has taken me all through the years of my life now, and it finds its way into sort of interesting, surprising moments along the way.
As I'm listening to this, that's one thing I really love about your story and your relationship with Bob that is cultivated even on this podcast. I just think of the word intentional. There's a lot of intentional thinking, praying, and doing that I hear from your story. Um, Specifically, we obviously want to talk about the book, and
Hmm.
you open this book with the story of seashells on the seashore
Hmm.
as an entryway into the reason that you wrote this book. We'd be honored if you'd read that introduction to the book
Sure.
for us. Would you be
Yeah.
willing to do that?
I'm glad to do that, really. Um, Let me just make sure that you can see that. But here is the seashell on, the cover of the book. And I wanted to work with a publisher that would allow me to have something to say about the cover art. And that had
Mm,
not been true before in my experience, but the publisher was gracefully, and they're serious people. They don't want to do stupid things at all, really. But we talked and talked, and they said, okay, you know, I found a Russian painter, uh, and after some month or two of negotiations, he said, okay, I'm willing to let you use my painting for the cover of your book. Um, but if you
mm,
look carefully, it's not only just a beautifully imagined watercolor of a wonderful shell here, but you'd have to look more carefully to see that, in fact, right here at the very beginning, the very most visible part of the seashell, there's a broken piece.
mm,
I wanted to find a seashell that was beautiful but broken. So here's the
mm.
beginnings of the book. Um, I've quoted Václav Havel as a little way into the introduction, the Czechoslovakian poet and playwright and eventually president. Quote, anyone who claims I'm a dreamer who expects to transform hell into heaven is wrong. I have few illusions, but I felt a responsibility to work towards the things I consider good and right. I don't know whether I'll be able to change certain things for the better or not at all. Both outcomes are possible. There's only one thing that I will not concede, that it might be meaningless to strive in a good cause. End quote. So then I wrote, broken alleluias. Even walking along the beach in the first hour of the morning, I think about the image of a broken alleluia. As my wife Meg said so plainly, so perceptively, you think about that all the time. And I suppose I do. Step by step, I see the shells of the seashore washed by the waves, each one wonderfully imagined, intricately formed, and yet, not all that it could be and should be. So very beautiful, but broken too, like everything everywhere. Though in my heart of hearts, I long for a different life, wanting with all that I am a different world. What I see is always marked by both joy and sorrow, never neat and clean, but instead somehow both at the same time. The work of my life is to find an honest way to live with both together. In other sense, more globally born, all of us work at that because in some sense we all have to, the world being what it is. And over the years, I've wondered and wondered again, reading and reading more, living in and through the days of life, feeling the tension of what is and what is not in my very bones. What is clear to me is that there are some ways of seeing that resolve the tension by denying that there is a tension. That's neither sufficient nor sustainable. The differences are real and they make a difference. All day long, we are confronted with both. We have to somehow make sense of the world and our place in it, being honest about both what is glory and what is ruin. But why broken alleluias? The words are from the poetic imagination of the singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, and his words run through my very being. With an artful, haunting eloquence, the song wrestles with the tension of life, the beautiful and the broken together, open-hearted wonder and melancholic despair, a broken alleluia. Truth be told, I've been walking the beaches of the world for a long time, looking for a perfect shell, sauntering through the surf, hoping that sometime and someday there will finally be. But what I find are instead are hundreds and thousands of shells that seem just about perfect, but are not. So many, of course, are terribly broken, now only fragments of what they once were. In the very different ways they make me sigh. But the ones that trouble me are those that appear to be more than that seem to be perfect until I stop and look more closely. The colors are always uniquely created, the shapes are always uniquely crafted, and from 6 feet away, they're amazingly beautiful. But when I bend over, the cracks are obvious. The almost perfect outline is not quite. The holes stand out. I find that each one is uniquely marred. I first thought of this walking along the Assateague National Seashore in Virginia many years ago, there to take part in the wedding of dear friends. They'd asked me to give the homily, to muse over the meaning of marriage as they made their promises to honor and love, till death do us part. So I did my best to celebrate the day, glorying with them in the happiness of the hour, standing as they were amidst family, friends, and flowers, with hope in their hearts. But given where we were, I also reflected on the shells I knew, each one so very special, but each one a reminder that nothing is perfect. Wonderful as they were, wounded they were too. Like every marriage I know, like every family I know, like every life I know, from the most personal to the most public, nothing we know is perfect in every way, and only the naive imagine otherwise. Slowly, slowly, we all realize that we have to make peace with the proximate. And simply said, that's the challenge of my life, of proximate justice in the public square, of proximate happiness in a marriage, of proximate pleasure in the work of our days. Every day I crowd against that conclusion, yearning for something more, my inward being groaning with creation itself, and eventually sighing over the weight of the world, knowing that everything is less than it could be and should be. As Bob Dylan said so poetically and profoundly, remembered, everything is broken. Broken dishes, broken parts, broken streets are filled with broken hearts. Yes, everything is broken. As true as it is for individual lives, it's also true for the public square, as it is true for the work and workplaces of our lives, as it is true for the friendships and marriages of our lives. All day long, I live with disappointment and grief and pain, like everyone else I know well enough to know. And while I live my life wanting more and expecting more, to remember another poet, Bono, I never find what I'm looking for. And why is that? Because I am a glorious ruin myself. In my heart and mind, I'm never more and never less than that. Both truths threading their way through the fabric of my life. And with strange grace, what is true for me is true for the world. Even the shells have a story to tell if we have eyes to see. So there it is.
Yeah, thank you for reading that. I love that. Uh, s- one thing that hit me when you were reading that is the quote, "But the ones that trouble me are those that seem to be perfect until I stop and look more closely."
Yeah.
Um, you say when I bend over, the cracks are obvious. Um, we can't ever expect to find perfection, like you mentioned, not in our work, our marriages, our churches, or society, like you said. Uh, but that doesn't mean it can't still be beautiful in the trying to make things closer to that. Or the word that you used, proximate, more proximate to that. Uh, you hit on it a little bit, but I'd like for you to just talk about what does it mean to quote the subtitle of your book, to make peace with the proximate.
Yeah,
What
it's a
does
good
that look?
question.
What does that look like?
Mhm. Well, proximate, is an unusual word, but it's not an odd word at all. Maybe it's more unusual than it might be or could be. But uh, like a lot of the words we use in the contemporary, Western world, it has a Latin root, proximi or proximatus, which means to be close to or to be nearby. Uh, and I first thought about it more seriously uh, many years ago when I was teaching politics on Capitol Hill for a long, long time in my life and wrestling with public policy questions and questions about tax reform and immigration and education and U.S.-Israel relations and U.S., you know, Africa relations and all the questions we took up year after year after year. Uh, um, Realizing that, that it was a pipe dream to think that somehow you could get the smartest people in the room, you know, have all the resources you needed, uh, and get it done. It would finally get done. You'd finally get this resolved. Everyone on the Hill would be saying, "Well, that's great. It finally got done, didn't it?" You know, there'd always be so much pushing and shoving that maybe a lot of things never got done because the pushing and shoving became so intense and so conflicted. Uh, about 15 years ago, I was asked by the editor of a magazine called Comment, um, and he said, you've been watching Washington, D.C. a long time, Steven Garber. Is there a vocation in the political world? And I thought about it for a summer, and I finally offered an essay that I called Making Peace with Proximate Justice. And what I was arguing in the essay was that if you're going to stay in a messy city like Washington, D.C. is, which is messier as the days go by, of course, um, a city of glory and ruin together. And Lord Bismarck, who was the German chancellor in the mid 1800s, put it, if you want to respect either sausage or law, don't watch either being made. That's a harsh word to say. I think when I first heard him say that, or first read those words, I thought, that's very cynical. I think what I came to realize over the years was that there was a hard-boiled realism about that, that you had to work through. Because if you imagined otherwise, you wouldn't stay very long. And for me, as Bob would know, that long interest in my life has been how do you stick with things? How do you stay at things? How do you keep at it over time? And so for me, the question of having a vocation in the political world was more, um, how would you stick with this when it's so messy and it's so hard? And so much is asked of you to give up on things you wanted with all of your heart. Um, and so it seemed to me that if you're going to stick with the hard, difficult, sausage making of political responsibility, you'd have to be willing to make peace with doing something that was more honest, something more true, something more beautiful, maybe even more good, something more just. But you never get everything in this now but not yet world we live in, which is our theological underpinning. We don't believe in any other world than that world. So if we confess that to be true in our worship, we need to somehow live that out in our work too. So what does it mean to live that out in the work of political responsibility, other than to somehow say again this day, well, could I give myself today, this week, this year, this next season of my life to trying to do something more honest and true and beautiful and good, something more just, and knowing ahead of time when all is said and done, not everything that I longed for will actually be seen in this life.
This week, I'm leading two of my student groups, one at Kent State Stark, University Stark campus, which is in Canton, Ohio, and one on the main campus in Kent. We're working through the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John. I
Mhm.
have them, I have it printed on the sheet, and we read it and we
Excuse me.
reread it, and they make notes and they observe what's there,
Mhm.
and then they ask their interpretive questions, and we ask those
Mhm.
hard questions, and we work hard on trying to figure out what does this passage mean, and then we apply it. Only then will we be able to apply it to our lives and how we work it out in the world around us. And so those opening verses are just amazing. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him
Mhm.
was life, and life of the light that and that life was the light of mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then we skip down to verse 14 and we go, wow, we're like, it's interesting. We're like, what's this word? How could it be a he? How could there be a personal pronoun for word? It's like, what is going on? And then verse 14, the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In the book, you wrote, and I quote, the Word became flesh are first of all the very center of the Christian theology that they summarize the meaning of the incarnation, but they are also a statement, I should say, they are also a statement of pedagogical genius.
Mhm.
So in terms of how we best learn the deepest
Yeah.
things, how do words become flesh, and why is that so
Mhm.
important? How do we best
Yeah.
learn, as you say, over the shoulder and through the heart?
Mhm. Well, that's such a good question, Bob. Um, so if I've taken this image of the seashell and I, made a confessional homily, to this young couple on the shores of Assateague some years ago, I saw them at the Jubilee Conference a few weeks ago, Bob. They were there. Um, they're still married and still working at it, and I'm so glad to see that's true of their lives. Um, but I would say that, word become flesh, as I said, in that my own PhD is in the philosophy of pedagogy. It's just a sort of unusual thing to think about, but I have long been interested in how we learn what we learn, how we learn in ways that actually shape who we are. Those have been the deepest questions of my life. And so I began to think years ago about chapter 1 of the Gospel of John, the Word became flesh and realized that every chapter that follows in the Gospel of John, every conversation recorded in those chapters, is one more window into the reality that the Word has become flesh and lives for a while among us. So it's this story of Jesus at the wedding in Cana. It's a story of Jesus and Nicodemus. It's the story of Jesus at the well. It's the court story of Jesus and Jesus and Jesus and Jesus and Lazarus and Mary and Martha and all the way to the very end. Every chapter is one more window into what it means that the Word becomes flesh and lives for a while among us. And realizing that um, we don't learn anything that matters very much to us without seeing that, in fact, it can be worked out. We just don't think about anything that you actually believe very much about. And you really sort of take it into like, this is Bob Robinson, this is who I am. Well, I would say nothing, Bob, given to what I know about you, is have you come too cheaply? It's been hard worked. It's been hard wrought. You've had to think about it, work at it, and the things you believe are things you've seen be lived out, seen be worked out in life. Perfectly? No. Honestly? Yeah. With reality? Yes. You know, because we don't actually take anything in that way into the deepest part of who we are, that we just read it in a book. Much as you have books in your life behind you right there, much as my house here is full of books, love books. My wife thinks maybe a little bit too much, even though she's a librarian, and she's gracious with me and she says, okay, 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 but we have books everywhere in this house. I love books, but I don't think that the deepest things we learn only come by reading a book. They shape and they influence and they affect, and I get that, and I love that about good books. But to be changed, be transformed, we have to see that the words can become flesh, that the ideas can have legs. Um, so for me, that's why it's pedagogically genius for God to say, revealing himself through the Apostle John, that this is who Jesus is. The Word became flesh. And then to have it be in the next 20 chapters, one more time after one more time after one more time. You want to see what this means, what this looks like? It looks like this. When Jesus took up the conversation with Nicodemus, it looks like this. When he enters into Bethany and Mary and Martha's grief and Lazarus's death, it looks like this. And one after one after one, it's always one more window into, and the Word becomes flesh and lives for a while among us. When it's all said and done, we think, I have a better idea what it means, what the incarnation, theologically speaking, looks like in life. I see what you're saying. I understand that now.
That's what I do. I teach, right? I mentor college students. And so
Mhm.
it's very cheap to do this Bible study and then say, okay, we're done. I've got to figure out ways to, okay, let's figure out how this word that we're learning becomes flesh. What are we going to do? Uh, Best learning experiences is like, okay, let's get up and go do something,
Mhm.
something that makes this real. So, we were talking today. I just had this group. It's like, what does it look like to be uh, glorious human beings made in this image of this Jesus, this God who is the image of God? What does it look like to be the light of the world? What is a real way that you are light?
Mhm.
That he brings light into the world, and he's asking you to be the light. What are some real tangible ways that you can do that? And then let's talk about that next week as we come back and figure out how did that go. And let's work together on this and maybe even hang out and do it together and see what it looks like as we hang
Yeah.
out and do things together. Uh, that's what life was like at Labrie, right? And when you were together and you saw people trying to live it out, not just teaching in a classroom, but it's like actually going to be living this out together.
I think it was a transforming pedagogy, Bob. That's what I think drew the people there, the 20-year-olds from all over the world, by the hundreds and the thousands over years. That it wasn't just ideas. People who imagined La Brie from a distance thought, well, it's a place for intellectuals. They go talk about big ideas, don't they? You know, it's for people who are like that. And I would say, well, you missed the point, really, because the point was to have breakfast together and lunch together and dinner together and be working the gardens together for half of the day, or chopping wood for half of the day, or and having a discussion at dinner every meal was a time for conversation about what you were studying about. Um, and so I would say that had a wonderful, wonderful invitation a few years ago to write the foreword or what was it called? It was the new introduction to Schaeffer's book, The God Who Was There. It was the 50th anniversary celebration of the first publishing of the book, and the publisher said, "Would you write the introduction, Steve?" I thought, "Oh my, I could try to do that." Um, but I did. But I mostly talked about what it was about the community life, the communal life, which was its own apologetic, to use a good word here, its own argument for the reality of Christian faith. Not so the ideas being debated or read about, yes, yes, that's a part of everything, never not a part of it. But I would say that the deeper apologetic was a living apologetic of that these are beliefs we have. We're going to live them out together in a community context over days and weeks, and come and be part of it. Come and see what this looks like in life. So I agree with you, Bob, about that. That was really the heart of, much of what the book is about too, because I've told a lot of stories of people in the book, um, and people who I would say in their different kinds of ways, whether they're Africans or Asians or Europeans or Latin Americans or North Americans, whether they're people who in some ways have wrestled with this business of the proximate, because I want people to see this is not just a Latin word, not just a political essay or reflection on politics in Washington, D.C., but in fact, diverse people in diverse places in very different kinds of ways have wrestled with this with their own integrity. So that's a big part of what I wanted to write about.
I love the thought exercise of making it practical. I think a lot of young people, I remember my time in college. I came from a background of the church, and the people I was around was very reactive and very like, well, heaven's over there, so we're just kind of waiting. And there's not much for us to do now. And unfortunately, that was a lot of my experience until I met Bob and
Mm,
got connected with the CCO of like, wow, there's people taking action. There's people that are doing good things, that are bringing light, being light in the world. So I think that's so helpful for young people, because I think a lot of young people read scripture and think, okay, well, that's all good, but that's very like big ideas and just overarching big language, and it's so hard to comprehend and then put it into action. We just read it and our eyes kind of glaze over a lot of time. So to actually have something come out of it, um, Bob, I remember when you had our college group do Lectio Divina, of reading scripture over and over again, and focusing on words that stood out to us. And that was the first time I had ever done that. And I was like, wow, this is really powerful, because I've never done it like this. Usually
mm,
I read it and I close it and I'm like, okay, thank you. But to actually meditate on what it meant, and then to go out and see how can I actually apply this in a real
mm,
way,
mhm.
was transforming. Um, and, speaking of my time in college, when I first started college, I was a theater major, uh, eventually became communications major, but I started out in theater. I loved being involved in telling stories. I did theater throughout high school and when I was little. Uh, you like to quote Walker Percy. It says, "Bad books lie. They lie about most about the human condition."
Right.
Um, but I guess the corollary to that is good books and plays, movies, poetry, music, whatever it might be, tell the truth about the human condition.
Mhm. Right. And you can see in that why the book is threaded through with my reflections on movies I've seen or books I've read, because I do think that they're worthy for more reflection. And again, because I wrote the book for people all over the world, I wanted the movies to be from all over the world. So there's a chapter, it finishes with a Polish film. There's a chapter that begins with a Chinese film. And I've done that from beginning to end in the book. Because I wanted people to understand that, in fact, that this is not just an American argument or American idea. This is not just have people in the West. I wanted people to actually to reflect on, in fact, these are in language I've come to prize very much. these are the deepest truths, the truest truths of the universe. And and I do think that bad films, you know, movies, bad political ideas, bad economic ideas, I mean, all of these various realms of life, that if the corollary is, well, a, a good film tells the truth about the human condition. A good political vision tells the truth about the human condition. And again, realizing, go back to my own 20-year-old sort of rambling, running through my own being as a 20-year-old and this dropped out communal life I was having in the Bay Area, realizing every debate I listened into, every argument I heard being presented in those years was one more argument for what it means to be a human being. And so whether we can tell the truth about it, but that's fascinating and intriguing and compelling, finally, I would say. Are we going to resist that and repress that and suppress that or twist that? So, so the films I've written about, in all their variety, I would say, they're wrestling with what does it mean to be a true human being. Uh,
And I know some of the examples you used, and I know you love the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings
mhm,
trilogy.
mhm.
I do as well. I was just talking about this with Bob before we started recording about how I um, watched Lord of the Rings when I was little. I was almost in that target audience when the movies came out. And I remember watching those movies in theater with my dad and sitting in the theater thinking it was one of the first times I'd watched a story that really hit home with me because
Wow.
um, the good and evil in the storyline, and also just the story captivated me. It swept me
Hmm.
off my feet, took me to someplace new, uh, helped me learn about the characters and cultures, even in a fantasy world, and the dynamics of their relationships. I remember being little and just being struck by that.
Huh.
Um, so, I mean, they're amazing fantasies, but even as fantasies, good fantasies tell the truth about the human condition.
That's the
Um,
point.
yeah, and as you know, these hobbits are very human. I know that I have always identified with the hobbits.
Me
We
too.
actually, yeah, they're very identifiable characters. We recently had a guest on the podcast who is a Christian film scholar who lives in New Zealand, and when I was talking to him about, oh, New Zealand, this is where they filmed a lot of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He said, "Yeah, I drive past Hobbiton every day when I come to
Huh.
work."
Huh.
So that was it was very cool, very unique, and
Yeah.
I tried my best to contain my excitement for that. One place I
Uh-huh.
want to go visit.
Right. Right.
Um, but Bob wanted me to read this quote from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Two Towers that starts
Hmm.
your chapter 8. The
Okay.
words of Samwise Gamgee to Frodo
Hmm.
Baggins, and they have been through way too much at this point in the story that they honestly should give up hope. But Sam says this quote that, yeah, Bob had asked me to read. So it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. That there is some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for.
Hmm.
Very, very powerful quote um, from Tolkien there. And even as I was reading that to prepare for this podcast, I was thinking that's how life can feel sometimes. We go one more day. Sometimes it's an easier day, sometimes it's a very difficult day. But we are holding on to the hope that there is some good in this world and it's worth fighting for. I know sometimes can feel so heavy. Um, And again, young people can look at it if they're in college now and think, where's the hope? What can I hold on to bring good into this world? But that's all we need is we're just needing a glimmer of hope.
You and I are living in the same world, David. Of course,
Yes.
I agree with you completely about that. Um, we have not talked about this, and I'll just throw it out for maybe we could pursue this a bit. But if the title is the hints of hope, and it's about making peace with the proximate, which is all true. I think it's very true. Um, but there's a threading, an under threading to the book from beginning to end, where I've worked hard to relate to wrestle with the relation of the words meta narrative to narrative. Uh, Now, I would say plainly to anybody, those are not words we have to all use to be good people, but they're not bad words either. They're words that people think about, talk about, whether they realize they do or not. You know, uh, Meta narrative is what? Well, it's what we think everything in the world is about. You know, uh, and I don't know whether a phrase like this can be recorded on your podcast or not, but some people in the world simply say shit happens. That's it. That's what it is. Nothing more, nothing less. Get over it. Stop being a romantic. It isn't anything other than that. So just get over it, okay? Why not then eat, drink, prepare for tomorrow we die? Come on, grow up. And So you see that even that sort of succinct, crude, in your face statement of meta narrative, all of life is this. Well, you see, everybody, consciously or not, thoughtfully or not, reflectively or not, everybody answers that question, what we think everything is about. Then the question, of course, if that's what we say on the one hand, would be all of life is this. Well, for me, the looming question then is, what are you going to do today with that then? How is this going to affect how you live today? So narrative, meta-narrative is that business of holding together what we think everything means with what I think today means. And so that question threads its way through the book from beginning to end. Uh, and when I listen to what you say about the conversation with Samwise and company, um, it's really about that, isn't it, David? I mean, what he's saying is, well, okay, today is this. I don't know what I can even go on because it's so hard. And of course, when you read the Lord of the Rings seriously, I find it in reading them, which I just keep doing and keep doing in my life. Um, I can only read a few pages at a time because it's so rich. You just can't take in a lot, There's so much to think about in every few pages. Um, but you realize that some of those days are just horrible, awful days, actually. And it just seems like everything is finally lost, you know. Um, um, I love, uh, how at the very last pages of the trilogy, when they're standing on the very edge of the water looking into the Western world and getting on board the ship, these words are given, but not all tears are evil. Uh, um, Well, those are really good words to hear in your life, because there's a lot to groan over in this world, a lot to cry about in this world, a lot of things that just don't turn out very well, and things turn out disastrously in this world. But to have, in some ways, the idea that um, that it's that there are things worth crying about, because that's what we live in. A broken, 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 broken world. Everything is broken, as Dylan said so plaintively. Everything is broken. So if we don't have some response to that, other than just to drink our sorrows into you know, the beer glass in front of us, or to smoke our way off into some kind of oblivious, nirvana experience. Uh, if you're actually going to live in the world and care about the world, actually take it up again tomorrow and the next day and the next day, you have to have some meta narrative, some bigger story to hold on to that somehow makes sense of even the hurt and the wound and the brokenness, because you realize that that isn't everything. It is not everything. There's still some good to be held on, even if we cry over what has been broken.
Yeah, I was thinking when I was looking at this question, um, the last the last part of Lord of the Rings when they're walking up the mountain and Frodo can't go any longer, and Samwise says, "I may not be able to carry the ring for you, but I can sure carry you." And he
Uh,
picks him up on his back and carries him, and again, that was another part where I'm like, wow, isn't this life? Isn't this some days we're Frodo and we need help. We need a mentor, we need a friend, we need community to help us get to our destination. And then some days we're the Samwise Gamgee where we can be the light into somebody's life. And I think that's such a beautiful, again, another beautiful illustration.
Yeah. You asked me about Walker Percy a while back, and maybe
Yeah.
I should just say this out loud because people might wonder, well, why hints of hope? Where's that come from? But one of the chapters I've written a little bit about this, where that language comes from, and it's Walker Percy, not surprisingly, but he had suffered terribly, and I won't go into all the grief of his life, other than to say, if you've ever thought about grief, and maybe you have, all of us have in some ways, but he grieved and grieved and grieved and grieved some more in the first decades of his life for the worst possible reasons that human beings have to grieve over. That was his life. Uh, and but at age 45, he had this desire to write something and finally submitted an idea to a publisher that published it after, surprise of surprises. And the novel, The Moviegoer, won the National Book Award for Fiction, which was a great, great surprise to everybody. Who was Walker Percy anyway? We don't know this guy. Um, but when the New York literary critics finally discovered Walker Percy, the winner of the National Book of Fiction, in The Moviegoer, uh, well, they thought that they wrote, we have discovered we have an American Albert Camus. So I won't go into the great detail, but Camus was a very notable Nobel Prize winning French novelist philosopher in the 20th century, and who took a certain literary philosophical pride in looking bleakness right in the eye. That was Camus' work. He wrote books like The Plague, The Plague. Uh, and So here's Walker Percy being discovered as the American Camus. And they say, well, then tell us about who you are. Why is it you write so much like Camus? You look bleakness right in the eye, Walker Percy. And he said, well, I think you get me, but you don't get me. Says, I have a lot of reasons to take sorrow seriously. And I write, my book is about somebody who wrestles, with melancholy and despair. And I've done that. That's what the novel's all about, actually, The Moviegoer. But he says, you miss me to think that's all that I've written. Because he said, there is always going to be a hint of hope in my writing too. When I first read those words years ago, they just jumped off the page at me, thinking,
Mm.
well, I get that. I get that. Can you be honest about the sorrow? Can you be honest about the pain? Can you be honest about the wound and the brokenness? We all need to be honest about that. Uh, But we also need to be honest in Percy's own best, response to the New York literary critics. But there's got to be some honest hope too for me. Some hint of hope is the way he put it. And so that's why I chose The Hint of Hope um, as the title for the book.
And the book is full of story after story of people who are working their lives, uh, looking for hints of hope in their specific place and time. Um, the world seems like it's so hard. We're in yet another war, and we're in David's generation, the college generation. They're anxious. It's like, why are we always in war? So there's, just layers and layers of terrible things, and even people are in slavery, and it's amazing that in this day and age, 2026, that so many people are enslaved. And not too long ago, I don't know, a couple decades ago, Linda and I, we discovered that uh, cocoa is just awful the way it is farmed, and the cocoa farmers are exploited, and we're just like, we can't buy chocolate, we can't buy Hershey's bars anymore. It's like the chocolate is coming from these sources that are just exploiting people and hurting people. And so, we're trying to find fair trade chocolates to eat, and we even did a family thing where we had our whole family write letters to the executives of the chocolate companies, dear Mars Corporation, dear Hershey's, dear Nestle, we think that you should do something about the way you
Hmm.
you source your chocolate. And so that was really heavy on me. And then you started talking about your work with the Mars Corporation.
Ah, I thought you were going to get there probably.
And I
Uh-huh.
was like, what? And it, as you're talking about it, it's like, and I'm explaining it to Linda, and she's like, what? And Mars knows. We need a lot of chocolate. We're Mars.
Yeah.
We make M&Ms and Snickers, and we've got a lot of chocolate going out. And
Dove ice
and
cream bars and all those
yeah, that's
things.
right. And so, how are we going to, you know, how are we going to source chocolate in a way that's
Yeah.
sustainable and it's
Yeah.
good and it isn't exploitative? And how can we do that tomorrow? We can't do that tomorrow. We can't do that
Mhm.
even next year. So what did you how did you get connected with Mars, and how did the Mars, everybody should know Mars is a privately owned company, family owned, not they don't have to answer to Wall Street, so they can decide what they want to do with their money. And so they decided to do something about this. How
Uh-huh.
did that all come about?
Well, there's nothing that I'm ever involved with, Bob, that is finally and fully heaven come to earth. I don't think that way. I don't believe that way. And I wouldn't talk about this project in that way. But I would say that it's a certain signpost to me of something good, something better than it might be. I like the image of signpost quite a bit, actually, because it isn't saying that everything has happened. This is finally it. You finally got there, but it's just saying a signpost. It's a pointing in the direction of, in our language, of the way business could be done and should be done. So 20 years ago, I was drawn into a breakfast with two executives of the Mars Corporation. Their headquarters is in Washington, D.C. And they had a question for one of the three owners of the Mars company, one of the Mars family members, who'd asked the question, what's the right level of profit for us as a company? Which, if you just think about it for a moment, you think, why would you even ask a question like that? Isn't that obvious? Wouldn't you make all the money you possibly could make? Come on. Isn't this business? Isn't that what business is about? To maximize profit? Especially if you're under the rules of Freudman capitalism, it's to maximize shareholder profit. That's the whole point of business. It has no other purpose than to maximize shareholder profit. Um, and but I spent probably 3 hours that morning talking to these executives saying, but why? But why? But why are you asking that question? But why are you asking that question? And um, I could talk about this for 3 or 4 hours with you right now, but maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, I would simply say that over the next months, we decided to name our conversation that morning the economics of mutuality. And the argument was that if a company like Mars, which is privately held, family owned, it doesn't have any interest at all in being positioned in the marketplace to be bought by somebody else next year. That's not the issue, not the question. The question is always, how do you sustain profitability? How do you keep making money? Think about it for a moment. That's what its
Right.
driver is. How do you keep making money over time? Um, I said to those executives that morning, literally at that breakfast we first had, if this is only going to be a conversation with the executives here in Washington, D.C., I'm not interested. This has to have consequence for those who grow cocoa in West Africa, so the Sierra Leones and the Cote d'Ivoires of the world. If what we're talking about here at economics of mutuality doesn't have meaning for those who grow cocoa, I'm not really interested in what we're talking about here. Uh, Again, much more could be said, but after we named the project Economics of Mutuality, to argue essentially that to sustain profitability requires an acknowledgement of a more complex bottom line that involves not only, if you made money, maybe you've made a lot of money, because Morris does make a lot of money, but actually have you treated people well too? Honestly and honestly about in the way you do business with them. Have you even taken care of the earth itself as the way you do business? Because there's more bottom lines to be accounted for than simply the bottom line of making more money. There's another bottom line about creation care. There's a bottom line about social relationships and working relationship with other people. Uh, so eventually I introduced those executives in that morning breakfast to a man named Peter Berger, who was at that point clearly the leading sociologist in the world. He was at Boston University at the time, and he's been his whole career looking at the question of the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And so we had a question about Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone and the cocoa producing countries, and wondered, would you create a research project for us, taking a research team for us to go to live in those countries for as long as you need to be there, to help us understand the relationship between healthy social ecology and financial prosperity? Other language for democracy and capitalism, perhaps. Uh, so we spent 2 years there doing on-the-ground research for us, looking at what mattered, what was important, you know, and
What was important to the people there in
the people
Sierra
there.
Leone,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
how they see life, how they
Right.
see flourishing in their
That's
own
that
language,
was exactly
in their
that
vision.
that was exactly the point, Bob. That's precisely what he was pursuing for us. So he did extensive evaluations, extensive analysis of the research they did, and I would say really on the basis of that, we decided eventually to come public with our thinking and to name it publicly the economics of mutuality. Um, and uh, and I would say that it's a surprising effort. I mean, I've said this all over the world the last years, but to put it very simply, the project itself is a surprisingly serious effort to rethink the business of business. And I was in Memphis, Tennessee last week with this project. I was in Seoul, South Korea last fall with this project. There are few days of my life that I'm not having some finger into the pie of this question of how to rethink the business of business. It's never, ever, in my mind, motivated by, and we are going to create heaven on earth here. That's not the eschatological vision in my mind. It is how could we create something that's an honest window into the way business could be done and should be done,
With a
realizing
hint
that
of hope.
a hint of hope. Exactly, Bob. That's precisely the point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's headquartered now in Geneva, Switzerland. And if anyone wanted to pursue it more fully, it's a remarkably robust website called the Economics of Mutuality Alliance. And there's a thousand, resources there that are available to see what's being done, who's working on this, and how it's being worked out all over the face of the earth right now. So,
And there's a link on there for an online version of the Oxford book about it.
yeah, the Oxford book. Yeah,
Oxford University Press published a book,
yeah,
and you could just click in one chapter at a time, and
yeah,
the whole
yeah,
thing is free online
yeah, yeah,
to understand what does it look like. And what's fascinating to me is this. This is now Oxford University, right? And other universities around the world are like, let's teach our students what this might look like
yeah.
instead of the bottom line is this, let's make the most money for our stakeholders.
Mhm.
There's maybe other bottom lines. What are we going to
That
think
was the
about
point.
that? What's fascinating is now there's students all around the world who are thinking about the economics of mutuality.
Yeah,
And there's and another part of that fascination to me is this, the sociological studies that were done in West Africa. The presumption of most Westerners would be, we know what they need.
yeah,
Let's go in there and give them what they need.
yeah. That was yeah.
And Mars was smart enough. You were smart enough. Peter Berger was smart enough. It's like, no, we need to understand what they need,
That was yeah,
what is their actual life, and how they
yeah,
define flourishing.
yeah. That's exactly the point, Bob. Because you're you, I'll say something even to add a little bit of frosting to the cake here. But when I pressed into that first morning, but why are you asking this question? But why this question? And why this question? Finally, the man who then was the chief economist from Mars, he said, "Well, when I was a graduate student many years ago in Paris, I came across the biblical idea of Jubilee." And he said, I've been fascinated by the idea ever since then. And now I'm trying to think with you guys, you at the table here, what would it look like to take this idea of the Jubilee of God in a multiple, complex bottom line of remunerating not only capital, but remunerating land and people too? What would it look like to work this out in the 21st century political economies that we now know all over the world? Uh, I took those two guys from breakfast several years later to Kentucky to visit Wendell Berry on his farm one day. And he said to us at the very end of the day words which have really shaped my thinking ever since then. They were so profoundly wise and true. But he said this, if you want to make money for a year, you ask certain questions, don't you? But you want to make money for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. And I would say this project is simply but truly, it's a more 100-year long project.
It's good to make money. It's good to be profitable, but what are we going to do with that profit? And how do we sustain the profitability
Yeah.
so that everybody within the ecosystem of our business is benefiting?
Yeah.
That's just so wonderful. And of course, they
Yeah.
haven't arrived yet. Mars isn't there
It's
completely
a
yet.
hint, a hint of hope. I'll give it with
It's
that.
a yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know where Mars will be in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, but hopefully they'll be closer and closer to Jubilee.
There's a huge amount of global, pushback because of the world and the flesh and the devil, which are not
Yeah,
just theological abstractions; they are realities. You know,
that's
because
right.
everywhere we go, there's always the pushback. Somebody saying, "Oh, come on now, business is business. Get over it." That isn't real business. Real business is if I don't screw you, you're going to screw me, so I'll screw you first. You know, um, and since you guys are Eastern Ohio, you know about the steel industry and what eventually happened with the, go for the jugular economics, be at play over the course of generations. The whole thing got lost eventually, you know, because, it's a short game. It isn't a long game. You can make money for a little while, as Wendell says, but you want to make money for a long time, you have to be willing to actually, I'll use our language, to embrace a more honest economic vision, which is an economics of mutuality, where everyone, the table is a bigger table, and you actually are figuring out some ways to honor everyone at the table, not just those who are the self-proclaimed owners of the game. You have to be willing to enter those who make the cocoa, those who grow the cocoa, and actually the trees themselves. This has never ever been greenwash. It's never been greenwash ever, really, because the real economic is if you don't actually steward the trees, they won't be there in 25 years. Um,
Well,
so there has to be a more complex bottom line if you want to make money for 100 years.
yeah. I just find that story to be fascinating. It's as you know, I work a lot with business leaders, and I bring this story up a lot because they need to understand. When I talk about this, they're like, "Oh, come on, Bob." It's like you
Uh,
said, it's like my job is to make money, and it's like, what? But what if?
mhm,
What if there's more?
yeah,
What if the goal of the reason God has placed you in this position of leadership is to be a conduit of flourishing for more than just your business, but
mhm.
every part of the ecosystem of your business.
That's a
What
good
if that,
word, ecosystem. Yeah.
yeah, what if that's the case? And it's like, whoa.
And
And
again, you're
there's, and
situated between Pittsburgh and Detroit. So even if you just take those two cities and think about the contrast between what I'm talking about here and what we know to be the sort of the sad histories of both those industrial giant cities in America. Um, the sad, sad story of Detroit was people on the streets in Detroit knew you didn't want to buy a Monday or a Friday car off the assembly lines in Detroit. Why? People didn't like their work at all. They hated their jobs. They got good union salaries, over time, for the work they did, putting the bolt in this tire or whatever it would be. But the working system was they just so despised it that they didn't make a good car on Monday because that was after the weekend. On Friday, no longer good because the weekend was coming up. So the wisdom on the streets of Detroit was make sure you get a Wednesday serial number. Well, you can do that for a while. But in Wendell Berry's language, if you want to make money for a year, you can do it, ask certain questions. But for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. So, what Detroit eventually found was that, that system didn't work. It fell in on itself. Uh, and eventually the big three automakers flew in their private jets to Washington, D.C. to say before, the Congress, we're bankrupt, bankrupt. The big three, we're bankrupt. And our model has not worked. What model was working? Well, they do it differently in Japan, didn't they? And we're beginning to buy Japanese cars after all, then Korean cars after all, because in some ways it was a different way to understand how this is supposed to work. I wouldn't say it's romantic or heaven come to earth at all. I was just saying that the way that steel being made in, your neighborhood there and going up to, Detroit as it was on the rail cars and the semis, that that industrial belt, that you live in right there in Eastern Ohio, it's its own poignant window into a capitalist vision that fell in on itself, which of course was the great downfall of the Carnegie, et al., steelmaking in Pittsburgh. The owners simply couldn't imagine that those who made the steel had any real business talking about how this was supposed to be done. Um,
Of course not.
yeah, of course not. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for your time, Steve. I appreciate it. These are great stories. The book again, Hints of Hope, Essays on Making Peace with the Proximate.
You're very welcome. It's a good use of my time to be with you two, David and Bob. Thank you for your friendship and for your interest in what this book is about. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Enjoyed it.